Today we have two topics to discuss. One is customizing the part list, and the other is understand how the item ID. Both items are related together because item ID is conditioning also how the part list will look like in our diagram. So we start initially with the part list customization, and then we look at how we can control item IDs in a diagram. If we go to HyDraw options, as you can see, we have several tabs. And actually, let me make a teaser for HyDraw CAD 2021. In this till 2020, HyDraw CAD 2020, we have mixed up a lot of HyDraw options. So we have list and charts, gauge port, property displayed, but it is not easy to understand which options are at the document level and which options are at application level. So in HyDraw CAD 2021, which we have a small beta, a first beta, we will see this kind of HyDraw options. So differently organized, and here we understand better what are document settings and what are application settings. So basically all the list and charts are application settings, while the item ID configuration is a document setting. So let me close HyDraw 2021, but in this case, it is important to understand that when we manage item ID, this is affecting everything that is in the document we are working on. So item ID is controlling this document, while list and chart is really a configuration that works in any document that we are creating. So let's get back to the main topic of today's webinar, customizing a part list. So as you see here on the left, I have several part lists already available. Let me choose a different pen color. Let me select part list, and we have several. As you can see, there is a flag, so we can define what is our default one. So for instance, I want this HyDraw Parker to be the default. I just check it. So this will be the default part list that will show up in during my part list creation. Although I will be able to select between any part list that I have in my setting. Let's see how to create a new part list format. So basically, you enter in the part list, and down here you can type the name of your part list format. So let's call it a VEST webinar. And then you click new. So this is creating a new part list format. By default, the part list will have following items, following columns, item ID and quantity. And you can define the size of each column, let's say 15 millimeters and 15 millimeters for the quantity. You can change header as well. So you can say QTI for quantity and ID for property name. We can make it as our default VEST webinar. And using the add command, we can select different properties between those available in the database. So it's not important if the properties are all related to all components in the diagram, but here you find the list of all properties and also design requirement. It's interesting because the part list can be really a mix of information that comes from model data and also design requirement. Let us make an example. So let's say that our part list, together with what we already have selected, which is item ID and quantity, we want just the model code and maybe the manufacturer, and we want also the rated flow rate. Okay. As you can see now, we have added some more information. We can define the position in our part list. So let's say the manufacturer is our fourth column, and we can change the header manufacturer, and we can change the name into code, and maybe the width for the code is 30 millimeters. The width for the manufacturer is 45. And rated flow is maybe 30 millimeters. Together with the attributes, we can define if we want heading, and if we want the heading on top or down, or no heading at all. And if we want to sort our part list top down or bottom up. So let's say that I want the heading down and the part is being bottom up. In addition, we can define an Excel template where we want to export the part list, and we can set the start column and the start row. As an example, I'll show you later the quote. In the quote, well, this is fine. In the quote, I have a template. So when in the last webinar, I generated a quotation of my schematic, the quotation was exported directly on a template. So this is our now our style for the West webinar, and we just click OK to confirm. Now let's see how this is working. So let us place a couple of symbols. Check. Let me make things very simple. I had just 2 check valve symbols. One, and let me copy to have 2 different check valves. And let me add some information. So instead of searching from Fluid Power Tools, I'm just typing a mole code. This is SCV1020 and whatever it is. And the flow rate is 20 liters per minute. And this one is RV10A01C and whatever, HYDAC, 40 liters per minute. Now we have 2 items. One is our CV10-20 HyDraw force, and the other is the RV10A01CN. Let's try to make a part list here. So in the system, we make a part list, selecting the components. Now our part list format default has become West webinar. And in the part list, we have some options like group identical items, include child items, and let's keep it. Next, we have a preview, and we can insert in drawing. So just selecting the top left corner and the bottom right corner. As you can see, the part list is made bottom up. The width of the columns is the same defined in our settings. And if we don't like how the text is positioned, so the left or right, we can also do the customization in the list. You can go directly to the list by clicking this small arrow here, this one. And if we want to have maybe middle alignment, we can select and make center alignment for the text, also for the code, for the manufacturer, and for the rated flow. Basically, this is how the configuration for a part list work. And now let's understand how we interact with the part list with the item ID. As I told in the beginning, our item ID is defined in the drawing. So if you change the item ID rules, these changes will have effect on the current drawing you are working. They will not have any effect on all the other drawings that you have made or you are going to make. If you want to change your item ID style forever, you must apply that change to the template, to the drawing template, because the drawing template will bring the default document settings that you are going to use in all your drawings. So by default, I use these settings, but later I will make some changes. So as you can see, I use the sequential numbering. I can define from which item my numbering is starting. So from item 1, in fact, when I placed the first check valve in the drawing, it took the item 1. I don't want to group by component code. We'll see later what that means. But I wanted to group identical items. and my grouping rule is I want a dot and numeric. But we may change, we may say I don't want any separator, and so the count will be alphabetic in this case. Let's stop here for now, and later we'll see the other options. So let me apply this change. Now let me copy just by using the AutoCAD commands, or you could use Ctrl-C and Ctrl-V. But by the way, use a copy selection and copy one component. Let me do copy selection from here to here and press enter. So as you can see, now automatically HyDraw has grouped the items 1A, 1B, because I decided that my grouping was not with dot, just by number and letter and no separator. This icon tells me that the part list requires an update. Let's, in this case, just recreate the part list. It's easier. Parts, select, enter. Again, Vest Webinar, and we click Next. And we place our part list in the drawing. And as you can see now, we have the middle alignment, as we have set. And now we have a quantity, item 2, quantity 1, item 1, quantity 2. And it is 1A and 1B. If you apply different flow rates, for instance, let's say that the item 1B is 25 liters per minute. Let's see what happens to our part list. Parts, next, and we insert in the drawing. So as you can see, in this case, HyDraw decided not to group identical items because the information is not the same across the same model code. So the priority in this case is given to the kind of information that we are displaying. Since we have a different flow rate applied to the two components, 1A and 1B, HyDraw splits them into two rows, 1A and 1B with quantity 1. If, on the other hand, we select a different part list format, like my Vest default, HyDraw default, next, now HyDraw will group the identical items, because in this case, I'm not displaying the rated flow. So the rated flow is the only difference between 1A and 1B. So in a part list format that is not including the rated flow, in this case, HyDraw will be grouping by quantity the item 1. Always, if you have any question, feel free to post questions. So now we have understood that we have possibility to control the part list, which attributes we have in the part list. And we have possibility to include in the part list also design requirements, which are not really model data dependent attributes, but are design dependent attributes. And we understand also how the item ID using the group identical items rules is working in a drawing in terms of part list. Let me switch back to my standard dot numeric. When you change an item ID rule, this change will not have any impact in what you have drawn so far. So if you want to apply that change, you must renumber items. And to renumber items in the drawing, you must use the item ID command. So you click item ID. In this case, I can select all the diagram, and you can make a window, or you can just type all with a keyboard, all, enter, and this will select all the drawing entities, enter. And when you reassign item IDs, you can also define a different starting point. I keep 1, but I could say start from item 20, and okay. So now it becomes 20.1, 21, and 20.2. If we renumber items, we select only the 2 at left, and we start from 20. And then we number only the other one, starting from 22. In this case, those are item 20, 21, and 22. Although item 20 and 22 are identical in terms of model code, HyDraw will not group them because they have a different item ID. So HyDraw CAD will group identical items only if same model code is applied, same attributes are applied across the same component, and the item ID assigned to the component is following the rules defined in the item ID section. The priority here is easy identification in the drawing, not to really have the exact quantity of the component. To have the quantity, you must follow the rules defined in the item ID part. Now let's see what happens by using the component code. Sorry, I lost the mouse. Okay, here it is. Now I want to use the group by component code. So component code is a different group rule that applies to component and is normally applied to mobile industry manifolds. I frequently seen HyDraw force Danfoss diagrams. So basically, by each component types, by all the component types, we can define a component code. And here is the component code. Component code will be used only in the numbering scheme using the component group as a prefix for each item in the diagram. So when I enable the component group item ID, like I do in this case, group by component code, it's enabled now. Now, if I renumber my items, starting from 1, that's okay. As you can see now, the item ID is following a completely different rule. We always have item 1.1 and 1.2, but as a prefix, we have CV, check valve. And the interesting aspect is that the prefix can change by component type. So if we want to insert a relief valve, now the prefix will be RV1, and the next one will be RV2, and so on, RV3. If we find a solenoid valve, directional control valve, let me check. Cartridge, solenoid operated two-way three-position valve, this will be SV1, and so on. So as you see, by using the group by component code, we can add a prefix to each component in the diagram. As of now, it is not possible to have a component code blank. It is not allowed by HyDraw, a library manager. In the coming version 2021, it will be possible also to leave it blank. So you can apply a prefix to a component type and no prefix to other component types. So you have more flexibility. Now, really, you cannot leave it blank, even if you delete a component code, but it will apply the standard Z component code, which is a default in the database. This will change from the coming version in 2021. Okay, let's forget for now the component code, and let's understand a bit more about accessories and assembly IDs. So basically, we all know that an accessory is a component that is related to another component, but it has no symbol associated. Mainly, we define accessory for coils, for connectors, for bolt kits, anything that is not physically represented by a symbol in a diagram, but we want to manage in a part list. So there are some rules and for the accessories. And as you can see, we can define the accessory as a sub-item of component or not. So when we say sub-item of component, let me clean up the drawing and let me renumber all the items. Starting from 1. So as you see, I get back to a different numbering scheme, so I need to renumber all the items in the drawing. Now I select this and I want to link to create a new accessory. Add new. I want a connector. this is item 1, it is not item 1.2 because it is item 1 second entity. So this accessory is related to item 1 and it is the accessory A. If we go back to the accessory, we can see that the accessory ID is alphabetic and we can have also a number as an accessory. So if we say number and with a separator dash as a separator and we renumber items starting from 100, we want to renumber also the accessories. Okay, now this is item 100 and 100-1. So with this numbering structure, we want to give priority to the fact that this accessory is related to the component. We don't care if this accessory is linked to other identical components. If you prefer to understand that how many same accessory you have in a diagram, you may uncheck this as a sub-item of component. You may not use as sub-item of component. In this case, the accessory will be treated as a component on its own. So if we renumber all the items, again, starting from 100, now we will see that the accessory is item 106. And if we have the same model code for an accessory, they will be grouped with the same rule, 106.1 and 106.2. So this is for the accessory. And in terms of position for the item ID of the accessory, we have this option here. So the accessory item ID can be stacked vertically, like in my case. So it is up or down, depending on where the item ID is with respect to the symbol. Or we can stack horizontally, which means the accessory will come on the right or on the left of the symbol. Let's try it. Stack horizontally. I want to add an accessory to item 105, new accessory, connector. Okay. It's on the right. If we move the item ID to the left and we add an accessory, coil and electronics, now it will be on left. So it is checking if the item ID is left or right or top or down with respect to the symbol. If we go back to the item ID, we see this option, display item ID for accessory. So if you want to manage accessory, but you don't want to see the item 2, you can just switch it off. So of course, this will not change what is already available in the drawing. If you want to switch off an accessory in a drawing, you select the component and switch off the accessory ID. But when that option is set, when you don't want to show the accessory, when you select a component and load an accessory, filter element, okay, sorry, I may not have applied. Okay, looks like we have a bug. This should not display the accessory ID. I'll check later. This is supposed not to show in the drawing. We can now hide manually, but it should not show in the drawing. Let's look now at the assembly ID. Let me clean up a bit my drawing. Let's stay with So as you can see, each item, let me change a pen color. Each item has an assembly ID. By default, it is blank. Assembly ID has the purpose to group items belonging to the same assembly, to the same manifold, to the same power unit, or whatever. You can type in whatever you want here, so you can say they belong to my assembly A, or whatever it is. It is easier for a set of components to use the item ID command and use it only to reassign only assembly ID. So we can say only assembly ID and make the assembly ID A for all the selection. Okay. So in this case, item 100.1 is assembly ID A, and item 102 is always assembly A. Let me bring a different component, and this one maybe is assembly B. So in this case, I have 2 items of assembly A and 1 item of assembly B. When we make a part list of these items, now, as you can see, the part list in my case is bottom up. So first we have the items belonging to the assembly A, and then we have the item belonging to assembly B. A3 is my accessory, this item here. So the assembly ID is also applied to any accessory of the component. So in this case, as you can see, the sorting in my part list is controlled not only by the item ID that is visible, but also by something that is hidden, which is the assembly ID. And so we are able to group items in a part list by assembly ID. If you prefer, you can display the assembly ID in the drawing. So this option is assembly ID display in the drawing. And if I do again the item ID and start from A, and do again here, start from B. Now, as you can see, the item ID is different. Now we have A.1, A.2, and B.1. A is not the component, is the assembly ID, and it is visible in the drawing. And we can make a part list in this case, and we can view it in the drawing. A1, A2, B1. Last information I want to give you is the following. So in the option item ID, we have this automatic numbering. So let me explain the rule and why sometimes you will need to switch it off. So now I leave automatic numbering on. Let me erase all and start placing components. So there are no symbols. The first one is item 1. The second one is item 2. And if we copy more items, enter, as you can see, they become 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on. We can view in the System tab all the components, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If we delete item 5, next symbol will take item 5. And HyDraw, in this automatic numbering, will fill in the gap from the start item ID up to the last item ID. Next one will be 9 because there are no more empty space, 9. The same happens if you copy, let's say that I copy item 6 and 9 to another drawing. They lose the 6 and 9, they become 1 and 2 because in this drawing there are no other symbols. But when you copy a diagram from one diagram to another, you may want to keep the same numbering. That's when you want to use the non-automatic numbering. So if you switch off automatic numbering and paste items, then the item will stay whatever it is for that symbol. And if we copy the items in the drawing, they will keep with the same item ID 666. Then it's up to you how to control, how to change. You can use the item ID, or you can go manually and say this is item 61, this is item 62, and so on. The other advantage of this non-automatic numbering is that if the last ID is 62, next one will be 63, and next one will be 64. If I change 64 to A, next one will be B, and next one will be C. So in this case, the automatic numbering is not in this case, the automatic numbering is not following the rule, the standard rule numbering 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to 10. It is following the last item ID selected for the component. And in this case, you can have additional control on the item ID.